No, I wanted to start today by asking how many of you had Mrs. James as a teacher in 7th grade? Maybe she wasn't called Mrs. James like my Mrs. James was, but I had a teacher in 7th grade called Mrs. James who I think believed that her class was the most important class on the planet. And she was very adamant that students be punctual, on time for her class. She was my 7th grade language arts teacher. She thought that her subject content, her subject matter was the most important thing we would ever learn in our lives. At least that's how she acted when we were late to class. Because tardies were something that she took very seriously, and I have to be honest with you, I was tardy to language arts more than once. But it wasn't my fault. See, I wasn't delinquent or anything. Language arts was always right after lunch. I played in the school band, and we had band sectionals right after lunch, which was a horrible idea for a number of issues. That meant that every day in band sectionals, my baritone was full of pizza crumbs and French fry goop when you go straight from the cafeteria to band. So then I would go on to Mrs. James's class, usually about 25 minutes late, but I always had a pass from the band director. I had permission to be late. You'd think that that would soften Miss James a bit. No. Mrs. James did not like people being late to class, even if they had a pass. So one day, when I was walking back to Mrs. James's classroom, one of my friends, Nicole was her name, was sitting in the hallway, not far from Mrs. James' classroom door, crying next to her locker. Now, I can't just walk past somebody crying. That would have been insensitive, it would have been rude. Plus, it would have meant that I would have had to go to class, and I didn't want to. So I stopped and talked with Nicole, and we sat on the floor leaning up against our lockers, and I found out that another boy in our class had been teasing her a lot at lunch, to the point where she couldn't even stand the thought of going in and sitting next to him in class anymore. Felt bad for the girl. So in compassion, because that's what we talked about during the prayer, in compassion, I decided to set aside what I knew would be the appropriate thing to do, to follow authority, to go to class. You know, those passes are time-stamped from the band director. It showed what time I left the band room, and Mrs. James checked that. But I thought, you know what? We'll deal with authority later. There's someone in need. In compassion, I need to respond. So I sat with Nicole and we talked. We talked for probably 15 minutes, to the point where Mrs. James's class was almost over when we walked in. And I explained to Mrs. James, Nicole was hurting. I couldn't just leave her out there. We both got referred to the office. We both got sent to the vice principal's office. Now, our vice principal, Mr. Hines, this was at North Middle School in Godfrey. Mr. Hines was a very kind man, but he was also a very strict and firm disciplinarian. And he backed up his teachers 100%. So when we arrived at his office and explained that we had not gone to class because I had a friend in need and I was going to sit and talk with her and visit with her out of compassion, Mr. Hines compassionately replied, "We don't do that. You can do that after school. You need to be in class." So he talked to us about the importance of not being tardy and skipping class. And yeah, this wasn't Nicole's first time to be tardy either, but this time was different, right? We weren't being delinquent. This was an act of compassion. I was helping a friend. And so I told Mr. Hines, with every bit of courage I could muster, I said, "Mr. Hines, if you're going to give Nicole a detention for missing Mrs. James' class today, you're going to have to give one to me too." That's courage, right? That's courage. So the next morning before school, when Nicole and I were sitting together in detention, my feelings of chivalry somewhat faded by having to go to before school detention. I still found a sense of peace in my heart because I knew I had done what was right. It wasn't what was legal in the school's rules. It wasn't what the authority wanted us to do. It outright defied the school's attendance policy. But I knew in my heart that what I had done was right, and I felt good about that. I even felt good about it a week later when Nicole turned me down when I asked her to the school dance. You'd think after all that she would have at least gone to the spring dance with me. But I did what was compassionate. That's what matters, right? So the question then is, when is it okay for us to stand up to authority? When is it okay for us as Christians to say, yes, we know what the rules are, we know what's expected of us, but we're not going to do that? That's a tough one, because Christians have been dealing with that since the beginning, and before our time, Judaism was dealing with that as well. And that's where we go for our reading today. In ancient Egypt, the Hebrew population was flourishing and growing as they were struggling, even under oppression. They were still growing numerically, and Pharaoh wanted their numbers to decrease. So Pharaoh had this horrific, evil plan to weed out the Israelite population by killing off all of the young boys. Any young man that was not yet old enough or strong enough to engage in manual labor was to be blotted out. And it started with the midwives. When the woman is on the birthing stool, if you see that it's a boy, end its life right there. And when that didn't work, it became a nationwide effort. When you see a young Israelite boy, we're talking infants, toddlers, and young children, the same age as my kids. When you see a young Israelite boy, throw him into the Nile so that he may drown. That's what Pharaoh instructed his country to do. That's awful. There's too many of them. That was the argument. There's too many of them. They're taking up too much of our land. They're taking up too many of our resources. I can imagine sitting in an Egyptian coffee shop hearing somebody complain about all of these Israelites who are becoming too much of an economic strain on our nation's limited resources. That was the conversation happening in Egypt. And Pharaoh says, we've got to put a stop to this. We have to limit their numbers. We need to get rid of them. So Pharaoh ordered the execution. Any boy that was not yet old enough to perform manual labor was to be put out of life. And this serves two tactical purposes. There are two big reasons that this was done. And the first, our scripture tells us, was a matter of military strategy, right? Because what if someday those Hebrew people decided to rise up against their Egyptian captors? Who are they going to need to fight against the Egyptians? They're going to need all those young men. So if you kill them when they're babies, you're killing an army before it can ever rise up against you. And the other issue was simple population control. If you take away all the young males, that sort of freezes the expansion of the population. That'll absolutely slow down their growth. This is absolutely horrific. It's evil. And if it sounds somewhat familiar to you, we've seen this in recent history as early as or as late as the early 1940s. This is exactly what Hitler did to the Poles, the Czechs, and the Scandinavians. If you kill the young men, you can control the population. Not everyone saw things the way Pharaoh did. There were those two Hebrew midwives who said, you know what? No. We have our orders from the king. We know what the law is, but God has laid compassion on our hearts. And we're going to choose instead to follow compassion. And so they concealed and hid babies. They did everything they could to save the babies' lives. Moses' own mother and sister, they defied the law. They outright defied Pharaoh's order. Who cares what the law says? This is our baby boy, and we're going to keep him alive. And then Pharaoh's own daughter, the princess herself, defies her father, defies the law. When she discovers that Hebrew baby, whom she called Moses later, she should have lawfully handed him over to the authorities to be executed, the baby. But she said, no, compassion. Compassion is the way, and instead she chooses to adopt the child. And this is where it gets tricky for us as Christians, because for most of us, we're brought up to understand that civil obedience, obeying the law, is part of our faith. I was raised to understand that as a Christian man, I should honor those who are in authority over me. I shouldn't push the line. When Mrs. James says class starts at 12:35, I should be there at 12:35. That's the way I was raised. That's part of our faith, to be obedient. But you know, part of our faith is also to let our hearts be guided by compassion, even when it means standing in defiance or against those in authority. And we have examples in our New Testament of Jesus saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, do what the law says there, but let's make sure that we're honoring God, even if it puts us in opposition to the law. Jesus, by the way, was in opposition to the law on more than one occasion. A large part of our faith is built on this defiance, this following God, even when the law says not to. So which way is it? Like Malachi and Brenda were struggling with in our children's time, how do we know which way to go? Law or compassion? Because those two things are not always going to align. So a story to tell. In 1963, the pastor of this church was, does anyone know? Manny, you're our history guy. Reverend Jansen. I had to look that up in the archives. Were any of you members of this church in 63? A couple of you. Okay. That was 20 years before I was born. So I don't know. I don't know Reverend Jansen. All it is a name to me. Unfortunately, I didn't even find a picture. I don't know anything about him. I just know that he was the pastor of this church in 1963. I do know another one of our American Baptist pastors from 1963, and I'm sure you've heard of him too. They called him Pastor Martin. That's what his close followers called him. The rest of the world called him Reverend King. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of our American Baptist pastors in 1963, who, along with American Baptist pastors from across the country, stood up in defiance to the law. They were guided instead by compassion. They let God's compassion lead their activities instead of civil law at that time. Because now, in hindsight, we can look at some of the laws that were in place, especially in the South, in 1963, and we can realize that there were a lot of laws that, quite frankly, were hate-filled, discriminatory, demeaning laws designed to suppress persons of color. That's part of our American history we have to deal with. We have to own it, we have to acknowledge it, we have to continually fix that. In 1963, the city of Birmingham, Alabama, had secured an injunction from a state court in Alabama prohibiting the public assembly of Reverend King and his church on the city square. They wouldn't allow him to have a church service to preach on the city square. Now, in 2020, we know that that is outright a violation of First Amendment rights. Today, we would see that not happen. I think we would know now that the government wouldn't allow that sort of injunction to happen today. If a church wants to have service on the town square, I don't think I would get arrested for that today. But things were different in 1963, especially to persons of color. In 1963, I don't think the city of Birmingham, Alabama cared about the First Amendment rights of a black church or a black pastor. Martin Luther King was arrested in Birmingham for organizing a church service and preaching in public. He was booked into the Birmingham County Jail, where he decided, like the Apostle Paul did when he was imprisoned, to write a letter. And it's one of his most famous writings. If you ever get a chance to look it up online, Google Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. He didn't write to his followers or his congregation. He didn't write this letter to his family. He didn't write to the government or to the courts who put him in jail. He didn't write to the media or newspapers. He wrote this letter to his colleagues, to other pastors. And his question for them was, why aren't you stepping up in courage to resist what you know to be evil? You can see it happening. You can see that people are not treated fairly. You can see that lives are not being honored as God would call us to do. Why aren't you pastors doing anything about this? In ancient Egypt, 2 midwives, 2 Hebrew women, Moses' mother and sister, and the daughter of Pharaoh all deny the evil actions of their government. They defy their government because they instead choose to follow compassion, the compassion that God has laid in their hearts. And in 1963, Martin Luther King couldn't even convince other pastors to do that. Because we have this condition as human beings, when it's not happening on your doorstep, when it's not affecting your life, it's very tempting for us to say, no, that's not our problem. Not going to deal with it. It's so tempting for us to say, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't concern me, therefore I'm not going to get involved. And we all have this temptation, this desire to sort of stick our heads in the sand. Because frankly, that's easier. It's easier. It's hard to get involved in a controversial matter. It makes us feel vulnerable to speak out when something is controversial. But what if those midwives in Egypt had done that? What if they had just stuck their heads in the sand and said, no, this is an issue between the pregnant women and Pharaoh, we're not going to get involved in that? What if Moses' mother and sister had simply obeyed what the leaders had said and not stood up in courage to defy the authority? What if Pharaoh's own daughter had said, you know, it's a Hebrew baby, it's not one of our children, it's not my problem? Boy, that story sure would have turned out differently for Moses, wouldn't it? It's amazing how that works. In big situations and in small situations, we will have points throughout our lives, each one of us, throughout our lives, where we will have the opportunity to either step up and get involved and to say, hey, God shows us a better way and this is not it. God shows us compassion and we're better than this. We're going to have those situations in life where we can be advocates and speak out for what we see in front of us. We're also going to have situations in life where we can bury our head in the sand and say, no, that's not my issue, I'm not going to get involved. See, the thing is, those are usually the same situation. It's usually the exact same, and we have to choose. Do we do as those do who saved Moses' life and defy authority because God has shown us a better way, a more compassionate way of living? Or do we simply walk the legal road and say, well, at least I got to Mrs. James's class on time, even if Nicole was out in the hallway crying? We have to choose sometimes, law or compassion. It's a shame that we have to choose that, but sometimes we do. By the way, I want to ask you, do you know what most of the pastors were saying to Martin Luther King in 1963? They were telling him to quiet down and just obey the law. If you would just obey the law, there wouldn't be any trouble. That's what they told him. To quietly obey the government, to go home, to quit traveling around and stirring up trouble. Some of them even cited the 13th chapter of Romans in doing so. That's that passage that tells us that the authority over us has been put over us by God, and that obeying authority is in fact obeying God. This is why it's such a divisive issue. Christians from the very beginning have been struggling with this issue. When do we obey authority versus when do we follow our hearts and what God has shown us? So in his letter to these other pastors, Martin Luther King says, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here, because evil is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their thus saith the Lord's far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city in the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel beyond my particular hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to that Macedonian call for aid. And sometimes I think we forget that we serve a higher purpose and a higher power. And sometimes that higher power and that higher purpose is telling us to step out in courage and compassion and to get involved when we see evil happening in our world. To resist that temptation to just bury our heads in the sand. To resist especially that temptation to prefer law and order at the expense of Christian compassion, especially when it involves vulnerable peoples. Let me be very clear about this. Our responsibility as Christians is not merely to be good law-abiding citizens. Our responsibility as Christians is to honor God's law of compassion and grace and mercy, because that's what God shows for us. That's what God expects us to show for others. And I don't think any of us are going to want to stand before God someday and try to explain why, when given a choice, we didn't choose God's law of compassion and grace and mercy. I don't want to have to try to explain that. So, does God sometimes ask us to do things that are disobedient or in defiance of the law? Yes. Absolutely, yes. I think I would have not been able to sleep that night had I walked past Nicole in the hallway and just left her crying out there. God has shown us compassion and expects us to show that to others, even if it gets us into some trouble. Congressman John Lewis calls that good trouble. He who's a good American Baptist, passed away recently. He says, good trouble. It's okay to be in a little bit of good trouble sometimes. And this is what happens with those Egyptian midwives in our reading today, isn't it? They defied the law. They defied the order of their king because God had shown them a different way, a way of compassion and grace. And God did this with Moses' mother and sister, and God did this with Pharaoh's own daughter, and God did this with Martin Luther King, one of our own American Baptist pastors, and God still calls us today to step up in defiance at times and to get involved when we see leaders making evil decisions, when we see people being exploited or neglected or cast aside or hurt. It's our responsibility as people of faith to be courageous, to show compassion, even when it means being courageous as one of God's own advocates. So in the 16th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus asks Peter a question, point blank, one of those questions you can't walk around. Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And we know that Peter says, you are Lord. And I think we're all asked that same question. I really do. I think that we're all asked that same question by Jesus. Who do you say that I am? It's not a question you can just answer with your mouth. It's a question that you have to answer with your hands and your feet. It's a question that you answer with your actions and your decisions and how you live your lives and the situations that you choose to get involved in or not choose not to get involved in. That's how we answer that question. And honestly, I believe if anyone ever has to ask you if you are a person of faith, it probably means you're not doing good enough living as a person of faith. No one should ever have to ask you if you're a follower of Christ, because we answer that question by getting involved in the world and by taking a stand for those who need God's compassion and grace in the moment, by doing what's right for people, even if it means putting us at odds with authority. That is a challenging issue, and it's one that we will probably always wrestle with. But in our reading today, we see that God is good to those who follow God first and foremost, even and especially when it's for the benefit of the vulnerable, for the marginalized, for those who Jesus had a special place in his heart for those who were considered social outcasts or minorities. And so today my prayer is that God would show us a path of compassion, that God would remind us of our call to love and righteousness, and that may we be so compelled to get involved and to walk this path that we talk about. May we be compelled to show our faith in courage, knowing that God's law is supreme in our lives. Will you pray with me? God, it would be so much easier if we could just read Bible passages that make us feel good. It would be so much easier if we could just sing songs about how wonderful you are. But Lord, your holy word, it confronts us. It confronts us with hard truths. That sometimes following you will put us at odds with those who govern over us. Sometimes living lives as compassionate people of faith will cause us to not fit in with those around us. God, you call us to be obedient first and foremost to you. You have shown us compassion and grace and mercy, and you do call us to extend these things to others. Give us the courage, Lord, to follow. Give us the courage to live as you have called us to live. Give us the courage to actually be people of faith. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.